Hello everyone. Before anything else, I would like to introduce to you the reporters from Group 3. Okay, we have Mindal and Francies Decolongan, and I am Junriel Inopia. The topic that we are going to discuss is about egoism, self-interest, and altruism. And I will be the one to discuss the psychological egoism and ethical egoism. And Mindal will discuss to you the argument against ethical egoism. And Francis will discuss to you the evolution and altruism. Alright, before I will explain the psychological and ethical egoism, I will share to you a very short story about the Nestlé's infant formula. Okay? During the 1970s and 1980s, Nestlé launched a marketing strategy in developing countries that lured countless poor mothers into infant formula dependency. Okay, if we are going to shorten the story, they gave some free samples that would last only few weeks, just long enough to diminish the mother's abilities to produce breast milk. Alright, however, proper use of it required up to 70% of a family income. So they have to spend about 70% of their income just to pay the infant formula. And the problem is they were not able to pay. So mothers diluted a formula, often with contaminated local water. So this was the result, the death of millions of infants from disease and malnutrition. Okay, after the decade-long worldwide boycott against Nestlé, in 1984 the company changed its marketing practices. However, even today some activist groups charge that infant formula companies, including Nestlé, are still marketing to poor mothers, resulting in 4,000 babies dying each day. Even the worst corporations don't intentionally set out to kill people, rather they are continually driven by the need to make a profit, which overrides all other considerations. Alright, take note. If people are harmed or die in the course of doing business, that's not an issue for them. Unless it seriously harms sales through fines, bad publicity, or boycotts. One lesson that we might learn from the Nestlé story is that corporations are chronically selfish. Again, one lesson that we might learn from the Nestlé story is that corporations are chronically selfish. Okay, we have here some questions that we are going to answer by ourselves. Okay, there are questions that we discuss in this chapter. There are many different kinds of egoism, but the two main types that interest moral philosophers are psychological egoism and ethical egoism. Okay, the first question, what is the place of self-regard, self-interest, or self-love in the moral life? Okay, is everything that we do really done out of the motive of self-interest so that morality is necessarily egoistic? And is some form of egoism the best moral theory, or is egoism really diametrically opposed to true morality? And the last one is selfishness possible, and if so, is it rational? So these are some questions that we can answer it if you are going to listen this discussion. Okay, egoism, another term for egotism, and the philosophy, an ethical theory that treats self-interest as the foundation of morality. Again, so meaning to say, psychological and ethical egoism are both treats self-interest as the foundation of morality, self-interest. Now, I will discuss the psychological egoism. Is the position that we always do, that act that we perceive to be in our own best self-interest. That is, we have no choice but to be selfish. We cannot be motivated by anything other than what we believe will promote our interest. I always try to promote my self-interest, and you always try to promote your self-interest. Okay. Another meaning is the theory that all our actions are basically motivated by self-interest. Again, all our decisions, all our actions are motivated by self-interest. Okay, for instance, a motorist who stops to help someone who has broken down. So that's his self-interest to help these needy people. A person giving money to charity. Okay? A soldier falling on a grenade to protect others from the explosion. So these are the examples of psychological egoism. Now, let's proceed to ethical egoism. By contrast, holds that everyone ought or should always to do those acts that will best serve his or her own best interest. Whereas psychological egoism is a theory about how we do behave as human beings. Ethical egoism is a theory about how we ought to behave. So that's the difference. That is, our moral obligation is to seek one's own self-interest, and the rightness or wrongness of our conduct depends on us fulfilling our self-interest. So these are the difference between psychological and ethical egoism. Okay, another explanation or another meaning about the ethical egoism. In philosophy, an ethical theory according to which moral decision making should be guided entirely by self-interest. Ethical egoism is often contrasted with psychological egoism, the empirical claim that advancing one's self-interest is the underlying motive of all human action. Okay, for you to understand well about the psychological egoism and ethical egoism, let's differentiate. Okay, we have psychological egoism and ethical egoism. In psychological egoism states that self-interest motivates all human actions, while the ethical egoism states that all people should or ought to be motivated by self-interest for their actions. Okay? Psychological egoism, a descriptive theory, while the ethical egoism is a normative or prescriptive theory. Next, psychological egoism, everybody is ultimately motivated solely by his or her self-interest, while the ethical egoism prescribes selfishness or self-interest to be the ultimate motivation for individual actions, and describes the reason for human behavior and actions. And while the ethical egoism recommends how human behavior or actions should be. So that's the difference, or that's the difference meaning psychological egoism and ethical egoism. Okay, try to look at the sentence that I was being colored and color red. Improve my reputation, or just to make me feel good. So that's the psychological egoism. And the ethical egoism, so regardless he conflicts with the interests of the others, as long as I can do this, I can do that for my own self-interest. So that's the real meaning of ethical egoism. Okay, so the next reporter will be Daniel Mindal, and let's give him the time. Okay, now let's proceed to the argument against ethical egoism. Supposed to be Daniel Mindal will be the one to report this topic, but because of some technical problems, I will be the one to do his part. Okay, aside from argument against ethical egoism, we have also the inconsistent outcomes argument. According to Brian Midlin, argues that ethical egoism cannot be true because it fails to meet a necessary condition of morality, namely being a guide to action. He claims that it would be like advising people to do inconsistent things based on incompatible desires. His argument goes like this. So we have 4 arguments that are being mentioned. First is moral principles must be universal and categorical. Second, I must universalize my egoist desire to come out on top over Tom, Dick, and Harry. Third, but I must also prescribe Tom's egoist desire to come out on top over Dick, Harry, and me, and so on. Fourth, therefore I have prescribed incompatible outcomes and have not provided a way of adjudicating conflicts of desire. In effect, I have said nothing. Okay, now let's proceed to the publicity argument. I will just show to you some important about the publicity argument. Okay, the publicity argument against ethical egoism states that an egoist cannot publicly advertise his egoistic project without harming. Okay, take note the word that are being highlighted. Project without harming that very project. On one hand, for something to be a moral theory, it seems necessary that its moral principle be publicized. Unless principles are put forth as universal prescriptions that are accessible to the public, they cannot serve as guides to action or as aids in resolving conflicts of interest. Okay, universal prescriptions that are accessible to the public. So these are the most important part about the publicity argument. Now let's proceed to the paradox of ethical egoism. What is paradox of ethical egoism? Can a person who is always concerned only with their own interest and never with others ever have truly deep friendship? So this one is what we call the paradox of ethical egoism. Okay, we have another one. Thus, the paradox of ethical egoism is that to reach the goal of egoism, one must give up egoism and become an altruist. I will just explain to you later what is altruist, the very antithesis of egoism. Okay, now let's proceed to the argument from counterintuitive consequences. So what is the meaning of this word? Counterintuitive. Okay, is something that goes against what you believe would be logical, or something that goes against common sense. When treating someone badly makes him like you more instead of less, this is an example of something that is counterintuitive. So, this is the important parts of the argument from counterintuitive consequences. Okay, we have another one. A fourth argument against ethical egoism is that it is an absolute moral system that not only permits egoistic behavior but also demands it. Helping others at one's own expense is not only not required but also morally wrong. Whenever I do not have good evidence that my helping you will end up to my advantage, I must refrain from helping you. If I cannot save the whole of Europe and Africa from destruction by pressing a button, then as long as there is nothing for me to gain by it, it is wrong for me to press that button. So that's the important part of the argument from counterintuitive consequences. Okay, the last part of the report of Brother Mindal is the problem of future generations. Okay, a final problem with ethical egoism is that there is no obligation to preserve scarce natural resources for future generations. Why should I do anything for posterity? The egoist asks, what has posterity ever done for me? The egoist gains nothing by preserving natural resources for future generations that do not yet exist, and thus can give no benefit to the egoist.
Evolution and altruism. Evolution. In biology, evolution is the changes in the characteristic of a species over several generations and relies on the process of natural selection. The theory of evolution is based on the idea that all species are related and gradually change over time. For altruism is the principle and moral practice of concern for happiness of other human beings or other animals, resulting in a quality of life both material and spiritual. It is a traditional virtue in many cultures and a core aspect of various religious and secular worldviews. If shared, an adulterated ethical egoism is an inadequate moral theory. Does that mean we ought to aim at complete altruism, total selflessness for the sake of others? An interesting place to start answering this question is with the new field of sociobiology, which theorizes the social structures and behavioral patterns, including morality, have a biological base explained by evolutionary theory. In the past, linking ethics to evolution means justifying explanation. 19th century social Darwinism applied the notion of survival of the fittest to virtually all aspects of social life, often leading of the position that might makes right. What does Darwinism mean of survival of the fittest? The dominant and rule-maker force in society is the most powerful force. As a result, imperial power dominance over pre-industrial nations around the world was justified. This theory leads itself to the propagation of brutal egoism. Nature red in tooth and claw is the law of nature. In more recent time, though animal scientists have argued for a more gentle view of the animal kingdom, in which animals often survive by cooperating with other members of their species, a social behavior that is at least as important as competition. The purpose for all these creatures is not just for their individual survival, as it is the survival of their genes. Indeed, in his book, The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins argues that behavior is determined evolutionarily by strategies set to replicate our genes. Of course, this is done silently by the unseen hand that controls perception. We are basically self-replicating machines. Morality, that is, successful morality, can be seen as an evolutionary strategy for gene replication. That is, groups who adopted morality increased their chances of surviving, and those that did not eventually died out. Here's a good example for the animal world. Like the lions, if the lions have a large numbers in their pride, they will be difficult to defeat, unlike the lions who are alone. Birds are afflicted with the life-endangering parasites because they lack limbs to enable them to pick the parasite off their heads. They, like much of the animal kingdom, depend on the ritual of mutual grooming. In this regard, it turns out that nature has created two primary types of bird: those who groom anyone and those who refuse to groom anyone but others who present themselves for grooming. The former type of bird Dawkins calls suckers and the cheaters. Suckers will perform well in the geographical area with hazardous parasite and just suckers or cheaters. However, cheaters will not survive due to a lack of collaboration. However, if a mutant cheater emerges in a sucker population, the cheater will survive and the cheater gene type will multiply. Suckers will slowly go extinct as they are utilized, but no evident obligation to serve those who manipulate us or to sacrifice themselves for individuals beyond our unique responsibility spheres. The larger lesson to be drawn is that we should provide moral training so that children grow up to be spontaneously altruistic in a society that rewards such socially useful behavior. What is valid about egoism can be blended with generosity in this way, resulting in deep individual flourishing. We are increasingly expanding the circle of our moral concern as we work to foster altruistic behavior in our offspring, eventually reaching all of humanity and possibly the animal kingdom.
Okay, for our conclusion, I will just read this paragraph. Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, once said that humanity is like a man who, when mounting a horse, always falls off on the opposite side, especially when he tries to overcompensate for his previous exaggerations. So it is with ethical egoism, trying to compensate for an irrational, guilt-ridden, sucker altruism of the morality of self-effacement. It falls off the horse on the other side, embracing a cheater's preoccupation with self-exaltation that robs the self of deepest joys in life. Only the person who mounts properly, avoiding both extremes, is likely to ride the horse of happiness to its goal. Okay? I hope that you learned something from our reports, and sorry for the technical errors, the English grammars, and the pronunciation. God bless us all.